Assalamu alaikum. My name is Neemat Kabutli.
And I'm Fida Abdo. Welcome to the On Purpose podcast.
This podcast addresses pertinent issues that affect Muslim communities in Australia.
We hope that this is the beginning of many conversations.
Enjoy this episode.
Welcome to today's MWA's On Purpose podcast. So we're joined here by Br Ghaith Krayem. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
So we've got an interesting topic that we're discussing today.
Interesting in many ways, yeah.
Interesting in many ways and very important, very critical to really get into this idea of masculinity in Islam, in the community, amongst multicultural communities, how it affects domestic and family violence, gender equality.
Gender equality is
yes,
important, yeah.
The role of men in families.
Yeah.
So, you know, when we talk about domestic and family violence, we will often look at women and the role women play and the responsibility women have. But you've been doing some very special work with men in this area.
Inshallah,
yeah. So we hopefully, want to get into and tease out a bit of this concept and discussion.
Looking forward to it.
Inshallah. So, we understand that as Muslims, being committed to our faith and looking after family is seen as a responsibility in the realm of men, right? Across Australia, though, we see that domestic and family violence is on the rise. Police are called out to incidents roughly every 2 minutes.
Unfortunately.
Yeah. Through COVID lockdown, we've seen such an increase in requests for support for women and children. From your understanding, the work that you've been doing, what are the current issues, the factors, the stresses within our community that actually contribute to domestic and family violence, particularly among men?
Look, it's a really, really interesting area. And I guess the first thing I always like to start off this sort of discussion is to emphasise that our community is no different to the broader community. Domestic violence is no more prevalent in our community than it is in any other faith community or in the broader community. And we know that for a fact now. Because
so you're saying it's not a Muslim issue?
It's not a Muslim issue.
Yeah.
It is a male issue. Unquestionably, it's an issue of men and men's desire to be in control. That's my personal view. We know this factually now because as part of the work that we're doing in MWA, and we'll share this a little bit more details, we did do a survey of the Muslim community nationally. Yeah. And we got over 600 responses to that survey around attitudes of both men and women, so Muslims generally across the country, to domestic and family violence and a whole range of issues. And we compared that data to the research which is out in the mainstream community. And there's almost no difference, right? So the attitudes around this issue within the Muslim community are almost exactly the same as they are amongst the broader community.
And what are these attitudes?
There is a lack of understanding around what keeps women in violent relationships.
Yeah, because the question is, well, why doesn't she just leave?
Why doesn't she leave?
Yeah.
Right? Why doesn't she leave? Why does she put up with it? Why doesn't she, make a complaint? So there's still an issue. And this is an issue across the broader community.
Yeah.
So we still have this issue of people, and it's not men, just men. It's women as well, who don't understand what a woman in that situation is going through and the inhibitors that are at play. You know, why can't a woman? And, we would be here all week if we were going to delve into the detail. But, that's a really significant issue for our community as it is for all the other communities. Some interesting things that have come up which start to break down some of the stereotypes. One, for example, there is a marked difference in the attitudes towards violence in familial relationships between older men and younger men. Now, contrary to what I was expecting and what others may be expecting, the older men in our community are much more aware and mindful of this issue than younger men.
So older men within the Muslim community?
Within the Muslim community,
yeah.
I'll use this label for want of a better one, are more progressive on this issue than younger men. Counterintuitive. That's not what I was thinking going into this, right?
No, because the perception usually, one would think is that the older generation have more oppressive attitudes towards women.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's what we assumed, right? And so we did this survey early in the work so that we could challenge some of our own assumptions. That was one that clearly played out. And interesting is I did a couple of focus groups when we were preparing this work, and I saw it play out. Which surprised me. I was in a focus group with young men who, they would be sort of mid-20s to mid-30s was this age spread, mostly tertiary educated.
Okay.
Right, so they are reasonably well educated young men, mixture of those who are married with children who are unmarried. They were really struggling with some key issues, and understanding in their own mind around what was the religious view on some things, and what are things which are probably much more cultural.
Yeah.
And so if there's an issue for us as a community, it's this intersection between culture and religion. We have to remind ourselves, Islam is not one thing.
That's
we're talking hundreds of cultures and hundreds of languages. Over the years, every one of those cultures has brought in things outside of the fold of Islam into their practices and their customs. And one of the beauties of our religion is it allows that. One of the rahmah of Islam is it's broad. I was going to use a phrase. It's a broad church, right?
Of Islam.
Of Islam, right? It has the macro principles that allow those customs to come into play, provided though they don't counter the core tenets of the faith. And this is an area where clearly, in my view, they have. Right.
Okay.
And so one of the challenges for us as a community, which is a genuine one, is actually to unpick where culture has come in and show what the faith itself says on some of these issues, and allow our identity now as Australian Muslims to actually come to the fore. Right? Because one of the challenges we have is we are living in a society which has certain views and mores and morals around relationships and gender and gender fluidity and a whole range of things, which we are challenged by.
Yeah.
And as a community, we haven't come to terms with how we actually respond to those broader issues. In this space, when we're talking about family violence, it is very much a hotbed for these discussions, right? So the whole mainstream sector and research in family violence has come out of the feminism movement. So we have to be honest about this stuff, right? So it is full of issues around gender equity and Western concepts of gender equity. So when you have Muslims and Muslim women in particular, so I'm late to this piece, the MWA has been doing this for 40 years, start to say to the sector, the domestic violence sector in Australia, hang on a minute, this isn't quite right. It doesn't work in every space. They are challenged by it.
Yeah.
And the work that we're doing right now is very much at the cutting edge of that. We're saying to the mainstream, if you want to engage with a minority community and a faith community, and particularly in our case, the Muslim community, you need to understand our value systems and our value structures, because you will not get any success in changing attitudes in society if you're coming in clearly from a point of view that says your values are wrong. We're saying to you, we don't believe that our faith in any way condones violence against women and children. We've now done a piece of work, 2 years of work, where we've built a framework, and that's what the FACE project is, and we'll talk about that in a moment, which clearly shows within the faith the principles that very clearly tell a man, someone like myself, how I should or shouldn't behave towards my family, my wife, my children, not just wife and children. This family violence impacts elders, there's elder abuse, there's a whole range of things. But gender equity has a certain meaning within my faith. And if you are not prepared to understand and respect that, then you're not going to have any credibility coming into this space to get this community to work with you on these bigger issues. You need to understand that we have a view around gender roles, which our faith is very clear about. That doesn't mean we believe one gender is better or worse than another. That might be counter to your views about gender equality.
Yeah.
But that's not my problem.
Well, I think just that issue, I think that's important to discuss, because sometimes it feels like we've been talking about, as Muslims, men and women are equal, and we've been saying that for years, and we're constantly being challenged. But what about this example? And what about this? And what about that? So if we are saying, right, all right, in Islam, men and women are equal, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ has set the example for us, right? What does that actually look like? And because you mentioned culture and religion, so often what we do, sometimes as Muslims, we say, but our religion says we're equal, and it's the culture that's come and had the negative influence. But you've said, but Islam is, this broad faith, way of life that accepts every culture as long as it's within that framework of Islam.
Yeah.
So where does then equality between men and women stand? Because this is a concern of Muslim women sometimes, whether women thinking about, well, why would I get married and put myself in this situation if no matter what, the man has the last say? You know, why would I do that? And if I don't have the Islamic backing for it, you know, how am I going to put myself there? So we'll get into what faith is and all of that in a bit, but from the, you know, the perspective of looking at current Australian society, the principles that we have currently coming through, and the Islamic values, how does that sit?
Sure. The framework we've landed on is centered around the family unit, right? So in Islam has this dichotomy in my view. At one level, we are responsible for our own actions and our own ibadah, right? So I don't need to engage through a priest or an imam to connect with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's between me and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But at the same time, Islam says to me, I have to subsume some of my personal freedoms and desires for the greater good of the community.
Yeah.
And at a communal level, the basic building block of an Islamic community is the family unit, right? And we have to call a spade a spade. That does pose challenges for modern society around issues of gender and sexuality. Now, we need to stop being scared to have these discussions publicly, right? Islam has a family unit, which is a man and a woman, male and female, and children. That is the building block of our society. Now, our approach to other things is a separate issue, right? And Islam has a history of actually discussing and dealing with these things, which most of our community isn't aware of and isn't ready to have those discussions yet. But if the building block is the family unit, what do we mean by equality? Our first principle as Muslims is, what's our purpose in life? Our purpose in life is to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Equality at a first level is equality in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Our Creator has said to us, there is no difference between a male and a female, right? In terms of you, other than what? In terms of your piety.
Yeah.
So in terms of, and this is the most important level of equality, in terms of our Creator, male, men and female, men and women are exactly the same, they're equal. But Islam then says, men, you have a role to play in this society. Women, you have a role to play in this society based on your gender, right? So we could be really clear about this. Islam does have gender-based roles. For young Muslims growing up in a Western society, that poses challenges. Yeah. Because in the broad society, they are exposed to popular culture, to media, to friends who find this in their language a bit backward. Why? Islam doesn't say you can't do anything. It simply says a functional family unit needs to have certain things happen. And gender, Allah has created men and women better suited to do certain things.
But so, just on that, because then when you come with that Western mindset of thinking, that almost seems like you're limiting, right?
Sure.
Yeah. So exploring that, understanding, well, hang on, if our purpose is worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then understanding how do we start to think, on why is our, thinking directed that way?
There's a war happening in Chechnya right now.
Yeah.
What's one of the first things the Chechen government did? It evacuated who? Evacuated the women, the children, and the very elderly. And who left behind? They left behind the able men. Why? Because as much as we might want to shroud this in as flowery language you like, able men are better able to physically defend their families than women and children are. I mean, let's be honest about it. It doesn't mean women can't do that.
That's right.
And it doesn't mean men can't work. I cook in my home. Yeah. I do 9% of the cooking in my household. I love cooking. Doesn't mean women shouldn't do any cooking. Doesn't mean women can't go out and work. What we're simply saying is, all things being equal, there is a natural inclination for the genders to do certain things, right? And we're not asking the Royal Society to agree with that. No. We're simply asking them to acknowledge that is what we believe. And a functional Muslim family where both the man and the woman understand what their role is and what vis-a-vis each other, but the family unit, it's not a problem because we understand that the role isn't something which my wife is forcing on me or my husband's forcing on me. My role is something which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said to me. I've created you for this purpose. And if I do things with that in the back of my mind, I'm not doing it for my wife. I'm not doing it for my husband. That's an extra benefit. I'm doing it because someone has told me, if you do it and you do this and you do it to your best of your ability, this is what pleases me.
Yeah.
And so if we keep that always as the first thing in our minds, what am I doing in this situation that's going to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? That's what, actually, in my view, will remove a lot of these issues for us. The challenge we have is, as human beings, we get caught up in the day-to-day. We forget to make that connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we compare ourselves to what we see around us. You know, young Muslim women compare themselves and see what their friends and their colleagues are doing. And they say, well, why can't I do that? Well, it's not that you can't do it. The question is, in our context, in our situation, what is best for you and your family? There might be times when it's actually incumbent on both parents to work for a whole range of reasons. You know, in this day and age, it's really hard. You know, if you don't want to deal in riba, in interest, and you want to save up money to buy a house because the rental market is so crazy, it actually might be an obligation on both men and women to work. The man, though, needs to understand that in doing that, the wife is actually taking part of his obligation on her shoulders. So if my wife's out there working, taking my obligation on her shoulders, what does that then place on me in that context? Do I expect her to come back from work, cook, clean, look after all the kids, and contribute financially to the family? Well, hang a minute. Husband says to me, your role as the male is to support her in the family. She has zero obligation financially to do that. If she's chosen to do that, where are you in this context? The least you can do is help and take some of her burden off her. That's what a functional relationship works.
Yeah. So it's grounded in reality, not theory.
Yeah.
You know, and I think, I mean, at MWA's been dealing with family breakdown, supporting families getting back together, husband and wife, for almost 40 years now. And within the Muslim community, it often comes to a certain, set of reasons. And a lot of that is a lack of understanding of what is domestic and family violence, right? And where is the man utilizing his power, and where is he being a man, and what makes him a man? And if his wife is working, is he actually less of a man? And is his power being threatened? And if the woman, as you're saying, is in certain circumstances then expected to work, well, then does she have more power in the relationship? And so where are we sitting with that? And how do people overcome these, influences and the reality of the, conflict it'll cause within their family as well? Yeah,
I think a big part of it is, men generally, forget Muslim men, just men generally in modern society are struggling with this issue of what does it mean to be a man? Yeah. This whole issue of masculinity and the emasculation of men as women find their voice, right? Men are challenged by that, and they shouldn't be, right? If you have a look at our own Islamic history, we've had strong women throughout the history of Islam, from Khadija radiallahu anha, through to Sidna Aisha, all the way through. There isn't a generation where you will not find strong Muslim women voices publicly, right? Men shouldn't be concerned and challenged about it. Men should be concerned when those voices are no longer there. I can't go out there in this day and age and speak on the hijab issue. What right do I have? I don't wear the hijab. I don't face the abuse that my sisters have every single day. There's nothing about me, like look at the way I'm sitting here. There's absolutely nothing about me right now, if I was out in the street, that someone would identify me as Muslim. Yeah. You walk out the street and you identify with every single person. You carry more of a weight on your shoulders for this day in this day and age than I do. So what right do I have to be threatened by you having a voice out there? What I need to be doing is actually thinking, what can I do that will help my wife, my daughter, my sister be able to better handle that burden she has in public? So what is it that I can do? How do I help her? Is there an education piece? Is there, I'm actually going to look after the kids today so that she can have some time to do X, Y, Z, because tomorrow she's going to be in this workplace or in this context or wherever it may be, and she's worried because she's going to get asked, why do you wear the hijab? Does your husband force you to wear the hijab? what rights do you have? How can you live in? I don't get asked those questions. Yeah. Right? No one asks me those questions. They ask my wife, they ask my daughter, they ask my kids those questions. Why am I worried about it? I'm worried about them and what support they have to be able to hold and not defend their faith. They don't need to defend the faith. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is more than capable. But how does he do it? He does it through people. How are we supporting those people who in this day and age are the ones which are the magnets for those issues? Right? So my message to the men out there is, don't be threatened by women having voices and strong voices and opinions. Right? Who did the Prophet ﷺ go to? There isn't a major event in the seerah where the Prophet ﷺ didn't go to one of his wives for advice or took her with him. So who did the Prophet ﷺ take with him on the very first hijrah for Umrah, when we had the Treaty of Hudaybiyah? He took Salama with him. Yeah. Why? Why did he take her and not one of his other wives? Because she had skills in politics. He valued her political acumen. And so when he had the problems on that journey where the Sahaba were almost rebelled, who did he go for advice? He went to his wife and she counselled him. It was her advice that he then followed. Why would we be worried about that? Yeah. Right? Why would we be worried about that? So my message to men generally, Muslim men particularly, is be thankful that we have strong women out there. Our responsibility is to be men and Muslim men. When we take up the mantle and be not males, but Muslim men, and what that means in terms of our honour, our integrity, the protection of our families, then our wives, our daughters, our sisters, they don't have to worry about those things. They come back to a home environment which they are safe and valued in. If you are safe and valued in that environment, it changes you completely. So what more would we want other than for them to have a haven that they can go back to? Whereas the moment they walk out the door, who knows what sort of confrontation they're going to face? Yeah. So men, you know what? Learn what it is to be a Muslim man. And that's not to be worried about your wife or your children having opinions or wanting to have a life of their own within the Islamic context.
So why is it? I mean, there's this term of toxic masculinity that is very prevalent these days, and men in our community are sometimes when they hear that term, sort of put up a wall immediately, because that's not for us. That's coming from the feminist ideology, and we don't condone this sort of language. Why is that so threatening?
I think there's a couple of points. One is it's threatening to men. It has been threatening to men generally, right? So Muslim, non-Muslim men generally have struggled as the role of women in society has evolved and changed. Overlaying that, in terms of our community, we have lots of cultural issues, but I think we also have an issue of still not really understanding or appreciating what it is to be a man within the Muslim context.
What is
right? We still have this issue, I think, where within our community we have this notion of man and power, right? That if you don't have control, you're not a man. Right? If someone's not bowing to your every wish and command, you're not a man. I was having a conversation with a group of young men and on some of these issues, and an example came up, and one young man who's a lovely guy, really lovely guy. We're talking about this issue of the man being guarding over his family, his flock, and he said, "Look, I have the right to choose who my daughter marries." And I said, "Well, in certain madhab you do, yes, right? I'm not going to challenge the religious stuff." And I said, "Okay." And he said, "Well, what if she wants to marry someone that I don't want her to marry, right? And she doesn't want to marry someone who I want her to marry." And I said, "Okay. Think of the context that you are living in right now, right? What is your intent in having that discussion with your daughter? Isn't your intent to get the best outcome for her? Is it best outcome for her or is it best outcome for you? Right? So what is your intent? A few hundred years ago, marriage was a transaction. And there was a whole range of considerations in deciding who a girl should or shouldn't marry. Lots of those considerations are no longer relevant. Yeah. So what's your intent? If your intent is her and her welfare and her benefit, you want to take her on that journey with you, don't you? Even if you absolutely have that, I'm not questioning whether you have the right or not. I said, well, what would you do if she doesn't? He said, well, if she married someone I didn't want, I wouldn't talk to her again.
Wow.
And I said, well, so you as a father are saying you would rather cut her off than understand and help her come on this journey, for her to understand why it is you have an objection to this person, or you have this. Right? So you would rather cut her off completely. So you're saying it's better for her, for you to be out of her life completely as a Muslim, as a young Muslim in this country. You would rather cut her off completely than for you to acknowledge that she wants a role to play in deciding who she wants to marry, knowing that that right of you having ultimate right decision is not consistent to that level across all of them at their head. Mm. I said, what would you do if your wife had a different, thick perspective on this issue? She didn't follow the same method you do. Mm. And she said, well, actually, you have to get the consent. You can't. You might be able to stop her marrying this person, but you can't force her marrying this person without her consent. What would you do with your life? Would you divorce her? Or God forbid, would you? He said, no, I wouldn't do anything, right? I said, well, what would you do? So in that context, if the foundation of a marriage relationship in Islam is around love and mercy and rahmat, do you ignore your wife's view on it? Because she's got an equally valid religious position. You can't say she's outside what Islam says. There is an accepted position that the girl should have a right to consent. Well, there's no answer to that. Yeah. Right. So and this is where culture comes into play. I'm not going to disclose what cultural background he's from, but this is where culture comes into play. And so lots of young Muslim men now who've been grappling with what it means to be an Australian Muslim anyway, and don't even start me on this, but remember, in all of this is all in the context of a world which is riddled with Islamophobia, yep. Right? And everything we do and say publicly is automatically looked at through this lens of these barbarian Muslims who behead people over in the Middle East, right? Yeah. And so young men in particular, this is where young men in particular have been really traumatized, generationally on these issues. So they're already grappling with being challenged, and they're trying to hold to their faith. And so they find it difficult really to see where that line is, that I'm going to be strong here because I'm defending my faith, but that means I've got to be strong everywhere. And what does it mean to be strong? Strong means I've got to have to say. She's got to do what I say, doesn't matter what it is. Right? Yeah. It actually takes 100 times more strength to be able to say, you know what? I'm going to teach you. I'm going to teach you what Islam says about X, Y, Z. I'm going to teach you why in this context, in this society, I would prefer that you did 1, 2, 3. But I'm also going to have a strong enough belief in the young girl or the woman that I've married that you will make the right choice here.
Yeah. So I think these connections between, being a man and it being dependent on control and power, Islam doesn't say that.
No.
Right? Islam doesn't say that at all. No. And that's why I asked the question before about toxic masculinity, because it's linked to control and power, that we're saying that, Islam actually, it works away at all of these and says a man, as long as he is fulfilling his obligation, right, before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's what makes him a man. Same with a woman, yep. Fulfilling her obligation as a woman. And that looks different in all different family situations. My family does not look like your family, does not look like someone else's family. So that ill of comparison really affects us as well. So in that context, you've mentioned FACE so yep. far, and I know that FACE is a culmination of a lot of the work that MWA has been doing, because MWA has been working directly with women, yep. right? And women facing, family conflict, domestic and family violence issues, and all of that. And then this project of FACE has come up now. And so can you just speak about the background sure. of FACE, how it came up, what it is, what its aims are, and what we are actually doing with
sure.
that?
So the full title is yep. called Saving FACE, right? And FACE is an acronym for Faith and Cultural Empowerment. So it's Saving Faith and Cultural Empowerment. As you said, the MWA has been a bit of a thorn in the side of the domestic violence sector from the very beginning, right? Because it has always had a view of family restoration as being, the hard way through. Not that it ever places women in danger or at risk, but as Muslims, family is really important. So if there's an opportunity to reconcile a family, we should always be looking at that. That's never been a popular approach in this sector from day one. And certainly, even at least in the last decade or so, I know publicly the MW has always spoken about needing to engage with men in this space, that you're not going to get sustainable change across society in this space if you're not engaging with men, right?
Yeah.
And there's the way, it always happens in this space. You always start with the leading edge, which is the victims, right? And so, and the male counterparts of the perpetrators. So almost all of the work with men in this space has been with perpetrators, right? So the people who are actually committing the violence. The only real work, though, with male perpetrators out there is around what they call things like men's behaviour change programs. How do we get men who have committed acts of violence to change their behaviour, right? And then when you delve into that even more, those programs are, in my view, take almost no consideration whatsoever around culture, let alone faith, right? So, I was going to say 3 years ago, maybe even 4 years ago, we did a review of those programs and their availability. And while some say they allow for language interpretation, the reason why we did that is because the MWA, in its homelessness programs, was referring men to some of the support programs because one of the factors leading to homelessness is conflict at home.
Yeah.
And so to support a whole family, you've got to find ways to support the men who aren't perpetrators yet, but there are risk factors there that you can clearly see. If something doesn't happen, one of the possible outcomes might very well be some domestic violence. But what we found was that the men were not staying in those or accessing those services, and we couldn't get our heads around why. So after speaking with them and then doing this review, it becomes a bit clearer. They're in English. Very few of them actually provide programs in a language other than English. None of them have faith in any way. So none of them, make any allowances for faith. They're taking a generic approach, which is for Western men, and simply say, here it is, right? And they'll translate some brochures and stuff.
And on that, because usually if they're targeted at a multicultural community, it's culturally and linguistically diverse. Diverse. So the culture and the language and the role of faith is what left.
Yeah. Exactly right. Yeah. So we realised that there was actually, even in that space, there wasn't anything. But the horse is bolted, right? So what we want to do is we want to go upstream, right? So the way you get long-term sustainable change is to actually stop the drivers, the things that lead men to be in a position where they commit violence. So FACE is what we call a primary prevention program, right? So it's not about working with men who have committed violence. It's about working with men.
All men.
All men, in our context, Muslim men.
Yeah.
So what can I as a Muslim man do to change those things within my immediate sphere of influence, so it'd be my family, my broad family, my community, my mosque, my whatever it might be, and therefore the Muslim community, and then from the broad community, around those things which lead men to become violent. So what is it that I can do to do that? Well, first of all, I need to understand what drives men to be violent, right? So the first thing that we do with FACE is we go through what the research says are the generic drivers of violence. So part of what we do is we want to work with Muslim men around, what they can do to make that change happen. But what we're also doing is we want to re-educate the sector, the mainstream community, on what it means to work with the Muslim community in this space.
Okay.
Right? So that means we have to have some challenging conversations there. Both of those pieces of work are underpinned by a framework which we've developed around principle-based around Islam. Mashallah, we've had some local Islamic scholars who've worked with us to extract out of the deen those principles which underpin the notion that violence against women and children is not acceptable.
Yeah.
Right. And so there's a framework that we've developed around, at its highest level, it's around what are my key relationships as a man? Who are my key relationships with? My first key relationship is with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. My second one is with myself. So what does it mean? Sidna Aisha described the Prophet as the walking Quran. That was his character. If I'm to emulate him, that means I've got to change myself. So am I day to day doing the things, forget anybody around me, am I doing the things for me that demonstrate that I am living the Quran? And then me and my family. Right? So what is my obligation? How do I act towards my family, to my wife, my children, my parents, my siblings. What does that mean? And then mean my community. Islam is a communal faith. Right? We don't live, we're not in isolation, even though we have been in isolation.
For now.
Right? But even if we're physically in isolation, right, we're not. That's why we hurt so much when we see our Muslim brothers and sisters overseas being oppressed. Yeah. You know, people say that they're in Myanmar or they're in Palestine. What do you care? I care because they're Muslims. I care because they're human beings, and no human beings should be oppressed, but particularly because they're Muslims.
There's a real connection.
There's a connection there, right? Yeah. Absolutely. So they're my key relationships. And so we delve through some principles. What does that mean, right? And then we break those down to another levels. You know, then we go into things like, you know, one of the key principles in Islam is the removal of harm. It's a positive obligation on you. If you walk down the road and you see a wood across the road, it's an obligation on you as Muslim to move it out of the way so the next person doesn't injure themselves.
Yeah.
So if I have that sort of an obligation, what does that actually mean in my home? So am I bringing harm into my home? I may not realise it, but, you know, I've been at work all day, or, you know, I go out there and I work 12 hours a day and I come home and I'm stressed and I yell at the kids because they're not quiet. They're kids. So am I creating a house which, if I'm really honest with myself, is an Islamic home? What does that mean? Does that, you know, if I come home and my wife is too scared to talk to me because I might snap, I've got to take a look at myself in the mirror. It's not her problem. Yeah. It's actually my problem. So what am I doing? What can I do? Right? Well, I need to understand what that means, you know, some of those principles. And it's at this level we start to unpick some of the language and some of the principles around what does equality mean. You know, what is gender equality? Now, on the flip side of this, what we do is we take that framework and we map it against the mainstream principles that are out there. And we say, you know what, when you talk about gender equality, don't come to me and say Islam isn't about gender equality, because I'm just going to show you how. This is what gender equality looks like in Islam. If you are looking for these phrases, you're not going to find them.
So these are the what sort of phrases?
Right. So when we talk about gender equality, we are not talking about gender identity.
Okay.
So if you're going to come into my community and want to talk about gender identity, that's not what we're engaging with. If you want to talk about gender equality, then I'm happy to talk about gender equality. Gender equality in Islam doesn't mean that we don't have specific roles as male and female, right? We do. Gender equality, though, means ABC. It means I, as the father, ultimately, and every leadership model gets to this point, says at some point someone has to make a decision.
Yeah, there's accountability.
Right? Even when you rule by committee, at the end of that, someone puts the hammer down and says, this is the decision. In the Islamic household, that is the father, the man. Right? I'm not going to delve with you around whether you agree or not, because we're not having a discussion here on the validity of my faith. That's not for you to decide. I've decided that already. I'm Muslim. And my faith says, at some point, I, as the head of that household, that's what it means to be the head. At some point, I have to make that decision. However, what you don't understand, and what a lot of men in my community are grappling with, are the processes that lead up to me making that decision. Me making that decision doesn't mean I do it in isolation. It doesn't mean I ignore what my wife says, what my children say. The number of decisions I make, which run counter to what my wife tells me day to day, I wouldn't even dare to count on one finger, right? That's not what it is to be a man. To be a man in a Muslim household isn't that every single decision must be made by you. You know what? It's to teach your children their faith. It's to provide for them. It's to make them feel safe and comfortable. It's to live the same principle that says the wife is the head of that household day to day. She's the protector of your castle. She can't do that if she's too scared of what you do and say, if she doesn't come and ask you every single little thing. When you do that, they will come naturally and want to engage and ask for your advice before they do anything, which they might even have the ultimate responsibility on their own to do. Right? At the end of the day, when we as a family, we have certain things, you listen to them and say, all right, we're going to do it. And I've decided this because of 1, 2, 3. So there has to be that exchange there.
So what is FACE doing to create awareness about it? Because this exists. This is the Islamic way. What you're saying, what you've shared, is the Islamic way. If we were living in an ideal, everyone living in an ideal Islamic way of life, this is what people would be practicing. But you've mentioned the stresses and all of that impact the application of that. So what's FACE doing to spread the awareness and increase this?
We've got to live what we've just talked about, right? So what we're not doing is going out and saying, you must do 1, 2, 3, right? So what we've got the framework, which is the principles. And so what we're doing is we'll run some awareness workshops, which will start end of March. These are all online. And we're going to make them accessible to any member of the public, right? So you can register, you can online, and you can attend the awareness sessions. Those awareness sessions are around the generic drivers of violence, because our view is you need to understand what the community out there, the broader community, the Australian community, sees as the causes of these issues. And then we will finish that off by introducing the faith framework. Those who then want to go to the next level, right? We want to work with groups of men across the country where we'll spend 2 full weekends upskilling them on a whole range of things. So the first one is we will get into more detail of what the research says are these issues around, particularly around leadership and collaboration, consultation, as opposed to coercion, right? So as a leader, if you need to coerce people to do what you want, that's not leading. That's oppressing, right? So we spend a whole day on these sorts of issues. We then spend a whole day talking about the faith and the principles, right? Because we know lots of people are going to be uncomfortable by some of that, because we're actually going to challenge some of their cultural issues. So we want a safe space for people to say, I thought Islam said 1, 2, 3. Well, actually, you know what? And we know we're going to have discussions about certain verses of the Quran. We know that, right? Let's call out. There absolutely is a verse in the Quran that everybody, even some Muslims, use as a basis upon which to ground their view that men can beat women, right? It is wrong, right? It is wrong, and it poses no positive obligation. And even the translation of that verse is challenged on many respects.
And scholars have interpreted
right?
it to understand.
But we need to have those discussions, right? And so the whole idea of that day is to equip those men with the ability to go out into the broader community and not be worried, not be scared. That if somebody says to me, well, your own Quran says this. Well, actually, no, it doesn't. That's not what it says. First of all, it's in Arabic, not English. So which translation you're using? There's 1,000 of them. They each use a different word. And even in Arabic, do you understand the way Arabic morphology works? And because even Arabs don't even understand that stuff, right? So we need to have those conversations. And then we spend a day teaching them around engaging at a community level, right? Because what we wanted them to do on the 4th day is come up with some ideas of things that they can do within their own community, and we will then mentor and guide them to run their own projects. I'm not going to go out there to my Muslim brothers in Darwin and say, I know what your community... How arrogant would that be? That would be doing exactly what we're saying. That would be a form of abuse, right?
This is what you're going to do. We've assessed this is what you need, right? And we're going to bring in this and apply it here.
The Darwin community is very different to the Sydney community, very different to Melbourne or Adelaide. They're all unique. So our obligation as community organisations is to actually work in ways which recognises their strengths and their challenges. And the challenges for the small communities particularly is we've had decades as communities on the East Coast, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne, where we've made these mistakes. We've gone through this stuff. They haven't had that ability. They don't have people on the ground who they can go to for that advice. So we're providing them that sort of support. But we're saying to them, you've got to tell us now what you think your community needs in this space. When you do that, we will then support you. We'll play the secondary role. So we'll support you with social media. We'll provide you the training, the tools and things of that for you to do what your community needs. But for you to do that, look at some of the principles that we're applying. Right? Who are these sort of projects? Who's at the heart of those projects? It's not actually you. It's your daughters, your wives, the women in your community. How are you going to engage with them? Because if you go out there and just say, well, we're going to do 1, 2, 3, that would be no different to me flying in from the big smoke into your regional community saying you're going to do 1, 2, 3. So we go through some things around how you engage, right? How you listen, how you make the voice of the person who is at the heart of this, the heart of it, right? So we teach them those sorts of things, and then we'll guide and mentor them to run their own project. So hopefully what that means is there will be something happen in each of these communities which is around this issue of men and domestic violence. But it also, they actually start to put into practice some of those principles around how you actually lead and consult and engage, which they can then take back into their home, their workplace, and start to actually take on board at a personal level.
How do you anticipate engaging with men? Because one of the challenges with, any sort of personal development programs, family, rights and responsibilities of family, all of those things, usually, even if it's, say, an event planned for men and women, usually majority women that attend.
Yeah.
Spiritual development, personal development, all of that sort of thing. When there are problems in a family, the first person to go and seek support is the woman, right? So one of the challenges then is men taking ownership and saying, all right, this is my responsibility. So how do you engage on that level?
It is one of the difficulties of working in this space generally. Look, I think the main point here is we've been very clear from the beginning that this isn't a project around placing men as the problem. It's in fact the complete inverse of that. This is a project which says men are the solution, right? The problem is the violence. Forget whether it's committed by, because yes, there is violence committed by women. There's violence committed by women against men, right? And we hear men in space saying, "Oh, well, what about the violence?" Well, yeah, of course there is, right? But let's be honest, it's small in comparison, but there is, right? But we're not looking at this as working with men who are potential perpetrators, right? Well, we're working with men who actually want to make a change, right? So we're reaching out to the community and looking for men who, in their hearts, feel this is right, but maybe have been challenged by not having the language, not having even the Islamic understanding necessarily to have perhaps have spoken up before or to do something about it. So we're saying, look, we'll give you that. That's what we will give you. We will equip you with that if you actually want to invest part of you in making that change. This issue of domestic violence, rightly or wrongly, and we know it's wrong, is one of those things which are used against our community. Yeah. Doesn't matter how many statistics we put out there, right? It's similar to a whole range of other areas which we have advocated for a long time. We will not change broader societal view with facts on this. The whole Islamophobia industry out there has our whole community lumped into this bucket that says Muslim men are violent. And we've seen it played out overseas, and so I'm sure it happens in the house as well. The way we will change that is simply by Muslim men making a change within their own space. That's the best way to do it to start with, and being the example that the Prophet ﷺ was. I challenge men to give me one instance. I say this to the young men I work with. Just give me one case only that's reported where the Prophet ﷺ physically abused any woman, let alone one of his wives, and they can't. Now the challenge for us is we're actually past that, right? So most Muslim men, most Muslim young men, get 100% the notion of physical violence, right? It is still an issue, absolutely, but at a theoretical level, we're over that argument, right? We don't need to convince any man in our community that physical violence is a problem. Our challenge comes with the other forms of violence, social, economic in particular is a real issue in terms of men understanding. Particularly when we then do overlay this notion of how a Muslim family is structured and works. Without you knowing, you might in fact be inflicting emotional and financial psychological abuse without you realising that some of what you're doing is going to do that. So part of what our awareness program is about is introducing these concepts and helping men think through some of the examples of how that sort of abuse plays out. We're not going to ask anybody, to look at themselves and say, "Oh yeah, this isn't one of these programs where you've got to sit and say, I'm an abuser." Right? It's simply saying, abuse takes many forms, and as communities evolve and develop, those more nuanced forms start to play out much more, right? And that's what's happening in our community, right? Physical violence is absolutely still the worst thing. A woman dies every fortnight in Australia, right? But for every one of them, how many women are out there? One of the reasons why women can't leave those relationships is the financial aspect. If I'm being physically abused, but I can't leave because I don't have the financial means to leave, that means for a very long period of time before that physical abuse started, I was under financial abuse. If I haven't had the ability to, be financially independent for myself to a point where I can't leave that abusive life, that means it's been going for a long time. But then for us, we then delve into this notion, what does financial independence mean from that perspective?
Yeah.
Right? I had an interesting discussion with some young girls recently around, there's this phrase that goes around the community now: what's his is mine, what's mine is mine, right? To reflect this notion from a black perspective that the husband has a financial obligation, but the wife doesn't. Now, it's not quite that black and white, and this is where I'm starting to engage with some of the girls. So actually, yes, he does have a financial obligation, but what does that really mean? It doesn't mean he has to buy you a Mercedes, put you in a 5-bedroom, right? Yeah. It doesn't mean you have a right to take his money without his knowledge, or to use money he might give for the family on anything that you put right there, right? Yeah. It's not that clear cut, right? But men, absolutely, you don't have a right to her income. So you want her to go out and work. She doesn't have to give you a cent of that. You still have to fund everything for the family. So getting them to understand, you want to be the leader of the household. Well, that's great. That's part of your obligations as a Muslim man. But you don't do that riding on the shoulders of your wife, and you take all of her money, and that includes money that the government provides under her name. The number of cases where the man in the household takes all of the funds, regardless of what source it is, and then dishes it out almost as a means of control.
Yeah, well, we see that a lot, and financial control, that's something that really plays a very significant part in then possibly escalating to physical domestic violence as well. And that understand, like that phrase that you said, his is ours, and what's mine is mine, right? And young women and young men love having these discussions, right? We see it happening all the time, and I think sometimes what is missing from that discussion is essentially everyone wants to live a happy, content life. So yes, if I work as a woman, what's mine is mine, and if I contribute to my family, that's actually counted as a sadaqah, a charity. And if I don't, that's within my right. But is that what I'm going to do? Is that how I want to live? And same as for a man, yes, it's his obligation to give and provide for the family, but does he do it only because it's an obligation?
Yeah, so this is where we need to educate our young people around what it means to be in a marriage.
Yeah.
And part of the challenge here is Islam takes a slightly different view around marriage. In Islam, marriage is a contract. It actually is a contract, and that notion of a contract is actually a very serious one because it has a lot of implications to it. But what we then don't do is go to the next and say that's a contract, but that's not the ideal marriage. Right? Your ideal marriage isn't the signing of that contract. What's the ideal marriage? The ideal marriage goes beyond that, right? The ideal marriage is when you stop thinking about what are my rights and obligations and start thinking about what can I do that's going to make my wife and my children happy? What am I going to do today that will make Allah pleased with me? Because when they go to bed tonight, they're not worried about X, Y, Z. Or my wife makes dua for me. Can you imagine the power of that? That I've done something today that has led my wife in her salah tonight to make dua that Allah sent me as her husband. I'm getting chills thinking about something like that. Right? Inshallah, my wife does. I have no idea. I would be too scared to ask. Think of the inverse. What if your wife in her salah tonight makes a dua that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gets her out of that situation in some respects, or says, Allah, what have I done that you've put me in this situation with this man? And what does that mean for my akhirah? Right? So when you move from the transactional into the relationship way of thinking, that's when a marriage starts to be what a true Islamic marriage is.
Yeah, and that's moving with really understanding the core of the family, being mawadda and rahma, love, mercy, compassion. It's that moving from transactional to transformational. And what's your reason for doing it? If you're doing it solely just to please your spouse, then you're going to get upset, right? There's going to be animosity. You're going to feel like, well, I did this for them. Why aren't they doing it for me? So we're elevating our intention. Yeah. We're doing it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's why bringing faith into this whole space is so crucial.
If you were working with people who identified based on their faith, the best way to get them to change is show them how their faith allows them to make that change. Most people want to do the right thing, right? What we're doing is saying to them, the right thing here is 1, 2, 3, and your faith says you should do this, and this is where it says you should do it. But we talk about this issue of rahmah and mercy, right? the one name that we call Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala more than any other is Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim. How many times every single day? Why does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala want us to refer to him by that name so often? It's because it's his qualities of mercy that we rely on so much. So what should be our fundamental approach to relationship with his creation then, if it isn't Rahman, it's mercy?
Exactly.
So what are we doing to create that atmosphere of Rahman and mercy in our own households?
And that's what we need to create space for these discussions to happen. So it's not just, I just need to protect my rights. And because that is because women feel that if they don't, then they may be abused. If they're not going to stand up there and protect themselves, then they're at risk of oppression.
Well, because men haven't been fulfilling their obligation of protectors. So if I'm not protecting them, they're going to find other ways to protect what they think. So when you're not getting what the minimum, you want to protect the absolute what you do have. Men need to stop thinking that they are losing by giving space. The strongest thing you can do is to give space to your family in the household. There's a story. I hope I don't get this wrong, but there's a story of one of the righteous Khalif. I'm trying to remember which one it was. I think it was Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, where one of the Sahaba came knocking on his door, and the reason why he came was he wanted advice about his marital relationship. He was having problems, and he knocks on the door, and he hears this ruckus, and he hears essentially screaming for a woman screaming, and he thinks, I can't come asking for advice. His wife is yelling at him, and he goes to turn away, and the door opens, and it's Abu Bakr, and he says, "Did you come knocking?" He said, "Yeah, I came." He said, "But I came to ask you advice, but it looks like you're the one who needs advice." He said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "Your wife is." He said, "Look, it doesn't matter that she yells at me. It doesn't matter that what that is. She does more for me and for my family and protecting me and protecting my family than this 5 minutes of raising her voice. If I can't forgive that, how else am I going to forgive me for all of my shortcomings with all of you?"
Yeah. So it's really broadening the perspective. And one of the last sort of things I want to touch on is that, when we talk about family, we bring in examples, and you've mentioned the Sahabiyya, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Sometimes as Muslims we're faced with, well, why are you looking at stories from 1400 years ago? Why are you bringing it? Look, why are we going? Let's look at now and here. There are many role models here, now in current modern day and age. But the position of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam for men and for women, right, cannot be overlooked. And the interactions, between Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his wives and his daughters, the fact that if Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would come into a room and Fatima was there, or Fatima was coming to a room and he was there, he would stand up, kiss her on the forehead, his daughter, and say, "Come and take my seat." The father-daughter relationship between men and women are at all stages, right? So it's not men versus women. It's together, and for women to feel safe and comfortable with the men in their lives. I mean, I don't think there's anything that would give women more strength than that. To know that my father has my back, my brother has my back, my husband has my back, that, they're there for me, and they're not going to utilize this, this power, arbitrary power to bring down on me. And so what is amazing, I think, about FACE is that we always talk about empowering women. FACE is empowering men, right? It's literally empowerment. Reclaim your faith, your attachment to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because sometimes where we fall short is in men thinking that, all right, this is the way of the West, and if I want to stick to my traditional values, then I can't follow this equality, sort of path. Yeah. Right. So working together, that it is possible. We do have these wonderful examples. So, as a maybe like a final sort of wrap up, where do you see this heading? Because, you've been doing this work over a number of years. We've seen different things and projects within the Muslim community, unique to Australian Muslim community. As a Muslim community, we are young, but we're growing, right? So when we compare ourselves to maybe the American Muslim community, we look at all of the things, wonderful things they have there. We're not there yet. And so where is this heading? What do you think is the impact it'll have on men and women in not feeling threatened by each other, and being able to work together.
I get there's 2 points I'll make. First, just to lead on your point around, why do we go back to that example? I hear it all the time where, and mostly comes from men, saying, when the Australian society, commentary, public commentary challenges our community around the role of women in Islam, and men are very quick to say, Islam gave women all these freedoms 1,400 years ago, we're so much ahead of the West. Very true. My response to that is, but are you actually doing it now? Are we men, right? We throw that comment out so quickly and so easily. Are we actually doing today what the Prophet ﷺ did 1,400 years ago? Or are we just happy saying he gave women these rights, but we've stepped them all back in the 1,400 years since? It's important that we go back there because he absolutely did give them those rights. What are we doing today, though, that embodies what he did, right? And it's not comparing women today to what they can do to women at that time to what they can do. You can't make that comparison. It's very different. You compare what women in that society could do prior to the Prophet ﷺ and after him to what women today could have done 10 years ago and can do today. You do that comparison. You tell me which is what the change the Prophet ﷺ did. We are nowhere near. Right? There's no way in the world we can in any way say that we've made any sort of change to that level, to the status of, or the way in which Muslim women in particular are being treated. Right?
The practical application of it, how it looks.
We are still having, we've got to be honest within our own community, but we're still having conversations about some women, some girls' rights to an education. When this community stops having to convince some parents that their daughters have a right to an education, then come back and tell me Islam gave women all these freedoms 400 years ago. But while we're having that conversation, you know what? Don't make that comparison. Other than, that's actually what we've got to do. That's what we want to do. So when a girl can go, feel comfortable that she's going to be able to have an education if she wants one, if she needs to work, that she's able to. It's even more important in this context because, we talked about financial independence. The number of young girls who go into marriage straight out of high school, for example, because culturally that's what's expected of them, end up in an abusive relationship, can't financially support themselves because they don't have a tertiary education, they've never worked. How am I as a parent safeguarding the future of my child by not equipping her with the ability, if she had to be able to do the minimum she could to actually get herself out of that situation? If I've convinced her that she doesn't have a right to an education, that she can't work outside the home, why am I asking myself, why does she stay in that relationship? What's her alternative? To come back into a household where I've actually created the environment that's convinced her that relationship is actually an acceptable one? So when we as a community, when we as men move away from that sort of thinking, then we have a right to compare ourselves with the Prophet. But until that day, you know what? Don't come and compare us to the Prophet. Other than say, that's what we should have been doing. Where faith is going, that's where I want it to go.
We're going back to there.
We're going back to the future, if you like. That we have enough men in our community who understand what Islam says, understand what the Prophet meant when he said and did all the things that he did, and what his intent was, and then live that day to day. That's what we want as a community.
Yeah, inshallah. I think we've touched on so much, and it would be amazing to just really explore all of these further, inshallah. And we hope that we can really see an impact and affect change. And it takes all of us coming together, men and women coming together on the same page. We're working together with that goal of pleasing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Sure. And I think when we do elevate our intentions, right, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Innamal a'malu binniyat," that actions are judged according to intentions. So as a community, where is our sincerity? What is our intention? What is our purpose? Right? Why are we doing it? One of the reasons this podcast is called On Purpose, right? Bringing back to doing things on purpose, not as an excuse, as, it wasn't on purpose. It wasn't on purpose. He did that, but it wasn't on purpose. Doing things on purpose, with focus. And if we really, really look to our foundations, the strength is there, right? Absolutely. The source is absolutely there. Jazakallah khairan, Ghaith. so much for the conversation. And, you know, we really, really do hope that we can come back again and say, you know, so these are the amazing things that are happening. And, you know, there is strength in our community. And we want to be able to nourish that as much as possible.
جزاك الله خير.
وإياكم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.